underneath anger is usually quite oftentimes fear. And we don't want to feel that. It's easier to feel anger than fear, and sadness and grief. And we'd rather oftentimes feel angry than grieve, because grief is a process that we really have to surrender to. And when we're angry, it's like the opposite of surrender. It's like we're very in our power, and we can be very indignant and justified and self-righteous. And that feels powerful, albeit a false sense of power.
Hello, this is the May Be Mindful podcast, and I am your host, Hannah May. I'm a mother of 6, conscious birth instructor and educator, spiritual growth facilitator, and certified hypnotist. This podcast is about inspiring hope, expanding awareness and consciousness in order to revolutionize the way we live and experience our lives. You can expect thought-provoking episodes each week spanning a range of topics, drawing from both my own journey of transformation and healing and working with others. I hope you find this podcast to be informative, refreshing, illuminating, and instrumental in your own soul's evolution and growth. Let's jump right in.
Hannah May here. Welcome back to my podcast. How's everybody doing? I want to talk a little bit about sort of a tender topic, which is anger/resentment, as it relates to forgiveness and how to sort of bridge that gap a little bit, because it can feel real tough. And I don't believe that forgiveness is a luxury. I believe it's a necessity. It's also the thing that you're going to be so happy you get to and on the other side of and into, because it's the thing that will radically transform your state of being, and it's the thing that will heal you and really set you free. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the obstacles and the challenges that come up in that, and some of the different types of anger and the purpose of anger, really, and how, it's really not something we want to dismiss. The mechanism and the need for and the purpose of forgiveness, because a lot of times we grow up with beliefs or forced apologies or just being told that we have to forgive. And all major religions teach forgiveness and philosophies. And even though Buddhism doesn't necessarily teach forgiveness per se, it teaches about compassion. And it talks a lot about letting go of attachment and anything that we're attached to. If we're attached to anger, then we're very blocked from that ultimate state and goal of enlightenment and freedom. And as with any other major religion, Judaism talks a lot about repentance. Hinduism, they speak of karma. And then in Christianity, Christ commands us to forgive. So why? Why are we being commanded to forgive? Is it because we're supposed to be subservient, compliant, like good little boys and girls, and we just need to do what we're told? No, that's not why. That's not the example that Christ left for us. It's the thing that transforms, and it's the thing that sets us free. It's also the thing that benefits and serves us when we move back into connection with our fellows and back into community, which is how, as a human species, we best function and thrive in connection, in community. And connection is the antidote to all disease, mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual, as far as I'm concerned. When we're harboring resentment or anger against somebody else or ourselves, then we are very much blocked in that relationship. And so how is that relationship supposed to thrive? Because when you see someone through the lens of pain, anger, resentment, then you're really only seeing them one way, and there's no more room for them to be anything other than the way you're perceiving them in that moment. And so it really limits the relationship, it blocks it, it cuts off connection. So imagine if it's your partner, your spouse, for example, or just a work person, like a teammate. How are you supposed to be a good teammate with that person? How are you supposed to do well the thing that you're supposed to do together and have it be successful, whether it's trying to raise your children or create a project or just enjoy life when you're in the presence of that person? It's not going to happen, and that relationship is going to disintegrate, which is why the majority, I believe, of marriages fail, it's because of a lack of communication and a lack of being willing to honestly address the things and the anger and the resentments that are coming up in us that then block and cut off connection in that relationship. We fail to see that person in their true light when we fail to have compassion for them. We also stay incredibly agitated, inflamed, and the flow of spirit and love is really cut off in us when we're living in that state, aside from the many negative health not benefits that you get from anger and the inflammation that it causes in your body. And so, a lot of times, these things that come up and agitate us are actually just projections of something from the past that aren't even necessarily based in the present moment. And so, we're really called to turn our attention towards ourselves when we become angry, which is the last thing we want to do. So that's a challenge. That's confronting right there because that calls for humility. And our egos don't want to step down when we feel we've been wronged. And when our nervous system, by the way, thinks that it needs to protect itself, which anger is a protective mechanism and actually serves a purpose, then we can just be completely disillusioned when we're not clear, when we don't know ourselves, when we haven't done our own work. So it really is, I believe, an invitation back to ourselves to get curious, to work through our stuff, and to heal. And underneath anger, and this is why a lot of people feel really repelled by the idea of forgiving, is there has to be a softening. And so why don't we want to lay down our anger? We don't want to lay down our anger sometimes because, well, for a number of reasons. Sometimes we feel that we're letting somebody off the hook. Who's going to hold them accountable if I don't? Like they get away free and then I have to suffer. But here's the catch, is that if you're bound and you're being held hostage by your own anger, you're not free anyways. And the only thing that really matters at this point is your freedom if it's causing that much problem in your life. And so it ends up being worth it. But the other piece to that is that we're not really asked to be the arbiter of justice. Like we're not asked to hold somebody else accountable. That's not our job. Our job is to take responsibility for ourselves. And of course, if the whole world just turned their flippin' focus and attention on themselves, I think we'd resolve the majority of our problems because everybody's problems really are within. Most of our problems are not external, it's just our perception of them. So the other thing is, and the other reason why it can feel incredibly tough is this shift that we have to make where we let go and we soften means we have to soften that harder outer layer, that shell. And that shell can feel incredibly protective and it can feel like it served us at some points. And maybe it was responsible and helped us survive with whatever we had to go through in our life as to why we developed that harder outer layer and why that anger came up in the first place. And so underneath anger is usually quite oftentimes fear, and we don't want to feel that. It's easier to feel anger than fear, and sadness and grief. And we'd rather oftentimes feel angry than grieve because grief is a process that we really have to surrender to. And when we're angry, it's like the opposite of surrender. It's like we're very in our power and we can be very indignant and justified and self-righteous. And that feels powerful, albeit a false sense of power. I will say that that anger serves a purpose when it needs to put us into action, because there is such a thing as righteous anger. If something happens to a loved one, for example, and you need to take action, that anger is going to be the thing that's going to propel you forward and maybe help you and support you in getting over your fears of dealing with it. So it's really responsible for a lot of positive change in the world as well. But the thing with that is you actually can't stay in your anger with it, because the way that you're going to be most effective is through love, because love is really the thing that transforms. So ultimately that anger has to soften. and it has to move into compassion, love, and forgiveness. And that has to be the main motive and driving force. And I would say that in a situation like the example I used, say if somebody harms your child, then your compassion and your love for your child is actually the thing that's going to be responsible ultimately for you wanting to step in to affect change for them, even though anger may also be present. So, the other really important thing that I want to say is that anger is just as critical and crucial a part of your healing process as forgiveness and compassion, because you can't actually truly get to a place of compassion and forgiveness until your anger has been acknowledged. You can't bypass it. And there's a lot of like toxic positivity and bypassing that happens with this when it's not really truly acknowledged. And the only way to truly acknowledge it is to really press into it, to acknowledge, to meet yourself in it. And so, because anger is very much part of the grieving process, it's a stage in grief. It really makes a lot of sense. And it's just something that has to be gone through. But when you really face it, I mean, you get on the other side of it and you dissolve it, because compassion is the thing that actually dissolves the anger and sets you free. And when you wake up to certain things and when you acknowledge certain injustices that you suffered, perhaps, whether it was something in your childhood or an event, or, I mean, most of us don't get out alive without some sort of experience, whether it was like a really brutal childhood or some degree of that. And by the way, I'll talk about abuse in a moment, but there's all different kinds of abuse that a lot of times, and trauma, that we justify and rationalize and turn a blind eye to. When we wake up to some sort of harm that we had possibly normalized through conditioning, because a lot of us were not allowed sometimes to express our anger honestly. So there's no avenue or outlet for that. So we learned to stuff it. As an example, I talk a little bit about narcissistic abuse, and you suddenly become aware of that in your life, then it's going to be shocking. There's going to be anger. You're going to need to move through that process, honestly, of allowing yourself to be angry because perhaps you were not allowed to, which is part of why you stayed so unaware and certain things stayed so normalized, because you were told, you're not allowed to be angry about this. I'm allowed to mistreat you. I'm allowed to harm you, but you're not allowed to be angry. A lot of times children were really disrespected by authority because they weren't seen as equals, and they're just expected to be okay with that. And ultimately, that has to go somewhere. That has to come to the surface. Everything has to come out in the wash. And so at a certain point, we're going to have to acknowledge this stuff. And to the degree that we're willing to acknowledge it is the degree that we're going to be able to let it go. The things that come at the cost of a harm also need to be grieved. If you experienced a certain type of upbringing that caused you to cut yourself off through fear, or however you were harmed from opportunity, or like a failed dream as an example, that's actually really common. So when we really become aware and awake to the cost of that harm, then we have a right to be angry, because we're sad. We're genuinely sad because of a loss. And that's really normal. And we can always move into acceptance with it. And there's always, usually, I find this really beautiful, God has this really powerful, beautiful way of really giving us everything that we're needing, just because it didn't come in the form of how we originally idealized or envisioned it. I'll just give you a little example of myself. Okay. I had a dream to dance, right? And I tried to pursue that professionally, actually, but I was a very much blocked in my addiction, and I was a very much handicapped, and I was not able to pursue that and access myself in the way that I needed to be successful. It's not that I couldn't have been successful, it's just it was not accessible for me at that time. And I was very much driven and in my disease and illness. And so that really felt like a loss to me. And then I ended up like having a family and having children. And, then I'm like, okay, well, now I'm too old. But here's the thing, I'm still a dancer. actually. And I still get to benefit and enjoy that. And I found hoop dance. And as a result of my hoop dance, my husband ended up putting me in these music videos that he did. That's not that big of a deal, but the point is that I still got to sort of live that dream, right? And I've still performed and I've still shared my joy with people who have been really grateful. And just as a really small thing, right? It's not always how we envision it because the ego sometimes wants the dream to look a certain way to build up the ego. But I remember I was dancing outside the gym one day and I would just go out there and I'd stick my headphones in and I'd just rock out with my hoop. And I was so free and so happy when I was doing that. And there were multiple occasions where people would come up to me and they would tell me things like, "Thank you so much. You made my day. Watching you made my day." Or like when I performed at my friend's wedding, this man came up to me. He was an older gentleman in his 60s. He used to dance for the Joffrey Ballet in New York. And he said to me, "Thank you so much for what you shared. I did not know this art form of dance existed." He said, "You completely inspired me. And I haven't felt inspired in a long time, so thank you." It makes me want to cry a little bit because the way that we impact and affect people when we reaccess ourselves doesn't have a time limit on it. So we can think that a dream is lost, but we have to be open to seeing that there's always a way around that because God exists outside of time. Okay. By the way, that was in my 30s when that happened. So it's not like I was too old. It was just my perception that I was too old. So the other reason why somebody might resist forgiveness is because they won't acknowledge their anger. So there can be a good amount of denial. And I've witnessed it where I have seen people who have the ability to stuff, where they don't have the luxury of having it come out uncontrollably, which I'm joking, it's not really a luxury because that can be really, really harmful. But so can repressed rage. And when somebody's living with repressed and stuffed rage, that is an internal storm that's really brewing in them. And it's sort of like this seething anger that's just bubbling under the surface. And maybe every now and again it might come out sideways, but that could be pretty insidious. And that can really only that can harm people around them because it can show up in ways like control, manipulation, or more subtle forms of anger, or like certain types of narcissistic abuse. And it's dangerous, but it's also really harmful for the person that's internalizing that because ultimately it's going to make them very sick. Eventually, I believe these things show up in our bodies, sometimes sooner than later, but it shows up emotionally, mentally, and spiritually as well. So there's a cost with all of it. It's sad for people when they live in that and they're not able to acknowledge that because there's so much denial that they oftentimes won't allow themselves to see it. And that's usually a situation where they have so much pain that's been unaddressed that it just feels completely unapproachable to them. So it really is a very unaware state. Their protective parts are pretty strong and keep them pretty blind. But the other sad thing about that is that they're not connected with their true selves. They really lose connection with their joy and with their true nature and who they came in as. And that's the thing that we really ultimately all want to get back to. So on that note of it making us sick and showing up in the body, it really makes a lot of sense because anger creates inflammation in the body. And inflammation is the root and the cause of all disease. And there's a large body of evidence and clinical research that shows that suppressed anger contributes to chronic illness. It also keeps a really inflamed perception where it deceives us. Therefore, we can stay in victim mentality. And this is really living in a state of like perpetual imprisonment. Another reason on that topic as to why it's helpful to forgive, because there might be some people in your life that you're like, I don't want nothing to do with them ever again. And that's perfectly fine, right? And you have the right to set yourself free from ever having to see somebody again. But you still have to forgive them because if you don't, then you still stay energetically bound to that person. So just because you release somebody from your physical presence doesn't mean that you're released from being attached energetically and being bound to them through that resentment. Because as long as you stay attached to your anger, then you're essentially bound and attached to the energy of that experience that you had with that person. And you're not free if that's the case. And so energetically, we set ourselves free, and spiritually, we set ourselves free when we let go of this stuff. But again, the journey into that is being able to see that person clearly and let them go. And this sight requires our higher self. And as I understand it, and as I've experienced it, it's not possible for my higher self to do this without appealing to higher power, because higher power is what gives life to my higher self and sustains me. So there really has to be a connection there. And I really personally have experienced the need for divine intervention with this stuff, because these things can feel so big and overwhelming. And it's no wonder that a lot of people go through their life without forgiving and stay really burdened and bound to their anger as a result of it. Another thing is that when we release any sort of attachment, anger included, it frees up creativity in us and allows us to access our birthright to joy and freedom of creative expression, which is in itself a cause of joy when we're in that state. So I hope that I have made clear the need to really honestly address our anger and acknowledge that in order to move into compassion and forgiveness in that place of clarity. Because when we're in a place of clarity and we're not viewing through the lens of pain or unhealed wounding and misperception, there's really only compassion and love that's left, because we really see things from the higher self in a higher vantage point. And it's really incredible. Now, sometimes we have a little dance of the ego. Like there's been things that I've wrestled with, and we have this dance, and sometimes, we can move into forgiveness, and then maybe there's residual anger that needs to be processed, and we'll kind of bounce back and forth. But ultimately, when you do experience that kind of freedom, then you realize there's really nothing worth holding on to. It's really not worth it, because your freedom is so much more valuable than any kind of effect that you get from your anger that might have helped you at one point, but really you see no longer does, because it's like a weight. And also noteworthy around addiction, for the large body of addicts and alcoholics in the world, I'm also going to say that forgiveness is a vital and crucial part of any sort of permanent, ongoing recovery and freedom. In the fourth step of the 12-step program, we are asked to do an inventory. And one of those inventories is a resentment inventory. If we don't get free of this resentment, then most likely we won't stay sober or abstinent. And that's because resentment is the number one offender, and it takes more of us out than anything else. It's funny too, because a lot of addicts also, speaking of denial, when you ask somebody to go ahead and make their resentment list, oftentimes they'll say, "Oh, I don't have any resentments." And you're like, okay, well, let's redefine resentment. Do you have any annoyances? Do you have any disturbances? Do you have any dis-ease around a person or a situation? Okay, yeah. So, sometimes we just need to redefine the word, because it can hide out under the guise of something else, and we can justify it and minimize it. But really, anything living in us that's causing us to self-harm is really worth addressing, inventorying, so that we can get rid of it, right? And it really is an incredible process where we get to see these things and see our part in them and get free of them, because we're no longer a victim if we see our part. And even in situations where we were victimized and we did not have a part, there's still an immense amount of freedom that we can get in that process. And I find it interesting also because it really aligns when I did my hypnosis training as a practitioner and my certification as a 7th path teacher and 5th path hypnotist. It was it really aligned with that work because there's a decent focus on forgiveness as part of that process for freedom, to forgiveness of others and forgiveness of self. It really dissolves anger at the root. When this is not something that we have to strive for, it's actually something that we allow. When we soften and we allow that to be removed through that process, then it really allows us to naturally segue and move into that state of forgiveness rather than having to try and force it or make it happen. You can't really force it or make it happen. That's not how it works. It's like healing. You can't force healing. You can't propel it and make it go any faster than it's able to go. It just, the process is the process. And the more surrendered and the more relaxed we are, actually, the quicker and the more accelerated that process can be. So just to summarize, forgiveness is not a weakness. It's actually a return to power, and it's the pathway into emotional, physical, mental, spiritual liberation and freedom. It's a process of unburdening so that we can rise, so that we can be more buoyant and have levity and access our true natural state. And it's a place of clarity, coming back into sight. And opening up our eyes and waking up sometimes can be shocking, but it's also very exhilarating when we see something clearly from a new perspective. It can be exciting. So, yes, it can be a mix of emotions and feelings. Welcome to the human experience, but it's also designed to really help us grow and see things from a higher perspective. So I might follow up with a forgiveness of self episode and self-compassion, because that is just as critical a part of our journey into healing as forgiveness of anyone else. And the two are very closely linked and related, of course, because our relationship with others are really just a reflection of our relationship with ourselves. And I love you guys and hope you have a great couple weeks, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you for tuning in to the May Be Mindful podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review. Your feedback helps us grow and improve. For more information, resources, and exclusive content, visit our website at maybemindful.com, or go ahead and follow us over on Instagram at maybemindful. If you enjoyed this week's episode, please give me a follow, screenshot the episode, and go ahead and tag me until next week when I bring you another thought-provoking and inspiring topic. Until then,